How's it going, everybody? You know, some of the funniest things that I see in this world are basically from animals. Uh, Especially when you talk to them and what have you. I mean, I'm not talking like dogs or cats, how they sit there and look at you, they tilt their head to the side. They're not the only ones that do that. Deer also do that too. And I need to tell you that where I worked at before, I had to travel up a long hill. And I made friends with two deer, one buck and one doe. Uh, I named the buck Bucky and the doe Sweetie. And when I would talk to Bucky, he would just sit there and just stare at me. But he became a little apprehensive of me in the long run, and I'll tell you why here in a minute. Now, Sweetie, on the other hand, when she would hear me, I mean, I would flash my flashlight in the wooded area because there was wooded areas on either side of the road. She would turn around and she would hear me after I flash, I'd spot my spotlight on her, and she'd just stand there and look at me until I spoke. If I sit there and say, "Good morning, Sweetie," this doe would sit there and bounce her head up and down. She would sit there and just jump up and down and prance all around and then look at me and wide eyes and ears up and tail up and everything else like that there. So, needless to say, Sweetie and I were basically friends, although she would never, ever, ever come up to me. She would always stand there and try to listen to me talk to her. Bucky, on the other hand, like I said, he'd stand there and look at me, but this is what made Bucky so afraid of me after a while. It was, I think, November or December, somewhere around there, and just beginning of wintertime, and it was the beginning of what I believe is the rut season. Well, I'm walking up the hill, I'm shining my flashlight, I see some figures out in these people's yards. And I noticed that it was Bucky and three other doe. And Bucky noticed my flashlight, so he decided to challenge me. He came about halfway across that yard, stopped right next to a nearby lone tree, and started snorting at me. And I'm sitting there and I'm looking at him, and it's like, okay, boy, if you got the balls to come across that road and try to attack me, I got a free neutering for you. Well, needless to say, he just stood there looking at me, and he didn't move. He just sat there and stood there at me. So eventually, I continued on up the road. And I come to find out every time I would see him or Sweetie out there, I'd say, "Hi, Bucky," he would just take off the other way. So he was definitely afraid of me. He was not going to get his ass neutered. Not not by me, at least, not during mating season. But anyway, one time it became clearly evident that this boy was afraid of me. So one day, another time I was walking to work, and I was just about at work, and there's a yard right next to me. His back was facing me. Sweetie was right behind him. They're both munching on grass. And my flashlight came on. Bucky turned around and looked. I go, "Hi, Bucky." The next thing I knew, now if you do not believe that animals fart, they do. Because no sooner did he hear me say, "Hey, Bucky," that boy just turned around, went and took off down the road. And Sweetie, she was still eating the grass, and she kind of like lifted up her head, and I sat there, I go, "Hi, Sweetie." And she looked at me, and then she sniffed the air. At which point, she turned around and got wide-eyed and looked at me. And I looked at her, and I said, "Hey, don't look at me. I didn't do it. He did it." She turned around, and she looked to where Bucky was already taken off. She turned and looked at me, still wide-eyed, and turned her head to the side, and turned around and trotted away. But ever since that day happened, I have never seen Sweetie Belle behind Bucky, because she was not letting him fart in her face no more. He always stood behind her. Okay, now, this final little bit that I'm going to tell you about Sweetie was when I was, again, going to work. I'm walking up, I just start my walk up the hill. I look in the wooded line right off to my left, just across the road from me. And there stands Sweetie. So I turn my flashlight on, and I sit there and go, "Well, good morning, Sweetie." And she just looked at me with wide eyes. And so I didn't want to keep the flashlight in her eyes because I didn't want to blind her so much. So I dropped the flashlight down a little. And when I did that, her head went down. And I brought the flashlight back up because I didn't want her to be blinded. Her head comes back up. And so I decided, well, I'll bring it off to the right. She leans right to the right into that light. Bring it back to the center. She brings her head back to the center. Bring the light over to the left. Her head goes over to the left. Then I turn around and I go, well, what the heck? I better, try to get the flashlight out of her eye, so I bring it back center, and she follows it right center. I looked at her and I go, what the fuck are you, a cat? And then she turned around and looked at me and tilted her head with her eyes wide open as if to turn around and tell me, what the hell's a cat?